to the emergency.
Yes.
Grace Plattel answered the phone that morning without a second thought. It was her son, who called frequently, usually just to chat about the baby or mention his plans for the day. This call, however, was chillingly different. "Mom," he said, "I killed the baby." The silence that followed was so profound, Grace thought the connection was lost. Then, his voice returned, quiet and final. "I'm heading to New York." The words buckled Grace's knees before she could even find a chair. Desperately, she fought to keep him on the line, trying to process the unthinkable, but Stephen's voice remained unnervingly flat. He spoke with a chilling finality, as if the matter was already settled, as if nothing she could possibly say would change a thing. With trembling hands, she ended the call and dialed 911, barely able to form the words, "My son. He just called me. He told me he killed his baby. And now he's driving to New York." The child in question was his infant son, the product of a union so disturbing, it defied all maternal understanding. This wasn't a relationship between strangers, but between Stephen and his own biological daughter, Katie. Even as dispatchers frantically worked to trace his location, law enforcement in 3 different states were immediately mobilized. They had no idea what they were walking into, only that the clock was ticking. By the time squad cars arrived at the address Grace provided, an eerie silence hung over the house. The front door was locked, with a key placed methodically under the welcome mat. Inside lay the first piece of a tragedy that would ultimately cross 3 states and claim 3 lives. A secret, buried for almost 20 years, had just violently surfaced. Before we delve deeper into this case, if you find this investigation compelling, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts on the case in the comments below. Your engagement truly supports the channel. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth case files. Thank you. This content is intended strictly for educational and documentary purposes. It in no way endorses, glorifies, or condones any of the criminal acts or individuals detailed here. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Stephen Plattel was always an enigma, a young man who never quite fit in. Back in the mid-1990s, he was living with his mother, Grace, in Levittown, New York, spending countless hours holed up in his room, taking apart old electronics or poring over gun magazines. Those who lived nearby described him as quiet and occasionally polite, but also reclusive and volatile. A smile from Stephen was a rare event, and it never seemed to touch his cold, distant eyes. His own mother would often just say he was different, a boy who became a man with a hair-trigger temper, capable of shifting from total calm to explosive rage in an instant. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in San Antonio, Texas, a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Garcia was navigating a completely different reality. Alyssa was sharp, inquisitive, and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. But like so many teens in the dawn of the internet age, she turned to the online world as an escape from her strict home life. It was 1995, and in the anonymity of internet chat rooms, where identities were fluid and words had no immediate consequences, Stephen Plattel found her. Their conversations quickly became a nightly ritual, a place to share stories about music, family drama, and their daily frustrations. For Alyssa, it was intoxicating attention from a young man who actually seemed to listen. For Stephen, however, it spiraled into a full-blown obsession. At 20 years old, he became convinced he had finally found the one person in the world who truly got him. What started as friendly chats soon veered into intimate territory, and within a few short months, Stephen was making plans to meet her in person. When he finally journeyed from New York to Texas, Downs Pravon, it was clear this wasn't just a casual visit. He arrived with a sense of ownership, as if he'd already laid claim to Alyssa, Her parents were livid, desperately trying to remind her she was still just a kid. But for a teenage girl craving to feel seen, what felt like love easily drowned out the warnings. Defying her family, Alyssa remained by his side, and by the time she was 16, she was pregnant. She clung to the hope that Stephen would change, telling herself his flashes of anger were just byproducts of stress or fear. But things only got worse. He was unable to hold down a job, and as money grew scarce, the fighting consumed their home. Alyssa would later recall the mechanics of his rage. It was sudden, explosive, and destructive. He'd punch holes in walls and shatter furniture, and the moment she tried to walk away, he'd switch to a cycle of tearful apologies and dark threats. He warned her that if she ever left, he would film himself making a permanent choice. Alyssa later recalled, "He wanted me scared enough to stay." When their daughter was born in early 1998, they named the little girl Denise. For a fleeting moment, Alyssa hoped the baby might soften him, that becoming a father would awaken some gentler instinct. Instead, Stephen's grip of control only tightened. He saw the baby as a possession, not a person. Alyssa began to notice unexplained bruises and instances where he would just silence the crying by simply shutting the door and walking off. At times, minutes of eerie silence would pass, and when she'd finally check, she would find him looming over the crib, his demeanor cold and impatient. It wasn't long before fear completely overshadowed any love she had felt. Alyssa came to the chilling realization that if she stayed, the baby's life would be in danger. She desperately searched for a way out, but every option seemed impossible, until she finally accepted there was only one decision left to make. Just 8 months after giving birth, Alyssa surrendered her daughter to an adoption agency, praying that a safer family existed for her somewhere. It was the only way to ensure her survival, she would quietly recount years later, and that is how Denise became Katie, a new name given by her new parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, a devoted couple from Dover, New York. They welcomed the infant into their home, completely unaware of the darkness she had just narrowly escaped, and started a new life for her in the safety of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by woods and long, open roads. As the Fuscos gently rocked her to sleep in their cozy living room, they had absolutely no idea that the same people who had given her life would one day be the ones to take it away. For nearly 18 years, Katie Fusco lived the kind of quiet, ordinary life that most people in small-town New York only dreamed of. Dover Plains was the sort of place where neighbors waved across their lawns, weekends were spent at local fairs, and the larger world seemed comfortably distant. Anthony and Kelly Fusco had provided their adopted daughter with everything they possibly could: stability, affection, and a true sense of belonging. They hadn't just rescued her from danger, but had brought her into a home where she was cherished just for being herself. Katie grew up surrounded by warmth and laughter. Her childhood was marked by art projects taped to the refrigerator and stacks of half-finished sketchbooks piled beside her bed. She was curious and endlessly creative, and even as a young girl, she had a gift for finding beauty in things others overlooked. When her classmates chased dogs from the schoolyard, Katie would be the one to kneel down and share bits of her lunch with them. Stray cats often followed her home, and soon her parents' garage had turned into an unofficial shelter. Kelly's brother, Carrie, used to call her Pac-Man because she was constantly snacking, a running family joke that Katie embraced. She became a vegetarian at a young age, not because she was told to, but simply because she couldn't bear the thought of harming an animal. Her empathy was effortless, as if it were woven into her very being. As she grew older, that same sensitivity found a new outlet through her art. Katie took a sketchbook with her everywhere she went. During high school, she would spend hours creating comic strips that her teachers occasionally displayed on the bulletin boards. And when the school implemented a strict dress code, she was the one who organized a small student petition, not out of defiance, but from a belief that everyone should have the right to feel comfortable in their own skin. She played the drums in the school band, finding solace in rhythm and motion. In a blog post from when she was 16, She described how art served as her anchor during times when words felt too heavy. A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me, she wrote. Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. For me, a life without art is no life at all. Those who knew her described a personality that instantly put others at ease, friendly yet thoughtful, ambitious yet grounded. She frequently spoke about her plans for college, where she hoped to study digital advertising or illustration. She pictured herself working for a creative agency one day, designing visuals that would move others the way art had always moved her. Anthony and Kelly supported her every step of the way, never pressuring her to follow a specific path, but instead encouraging her to always stay true to herself. To any outsider, it was a life defined by simplicity and love, the kind of foundation that promised a bright future. But on her 18th birthday, a natural curiosity began to stir. Katie had, for her entire life, known she was adopted. Her parents had shared the story with her as soon as she was old enough to understand, and she never held any resentment toward them for it. Still, as she crossed the threshold into adulthood, a part of her yearned for answers about her origins, about the people who had given her up, and about the chapter of her life that began long before she had any memories of her own. And so, without fully realizing the implications, she began to pry open a door that had been sealed shut for nearly 2 decades, a door that would ultimately lead her back to the very man who was never meant to be in her life again. And so, one night, she opened her laptop, hopping on Facebook. It only took a few hours of digging before she found them. Stephen and Alyssa Plattel, her birth parents. Their profiles looked pretty ordinary. Just a family in Virginia, with pictures of 2 younger daughters and what seemed like a solid, stable home. It all looked innocent enough, maybe even promising. Katie reached out, and in just a few days, they were talking. Soon, those messages escalated to late-night phone calls, and it wasn't long before they all decided to meet up in person. That first meeting took place in August of 2016, and for Katie, it was like a dream come true, a long overdue reunion, like finding a missing piece of her own life story. She made the choice to move in with them for a bit in Henrico County, Virginia, a peaceful suburb that seemed to offer a safe haven. However, as soon as Katie settled in, that storybook reunion started to show some cracks. Alyssa, who'd already spent years walking on eggshells around Stephen's volatile temper, felt that old, familiar tension seeping back into the home. She and Stephen had been sleeping in separate bedrooms for months, and their conversations, no matter how calm they started, usually blew up into shouting matches. Alyssa prayed Katie wouldn't pick up on it, but in a house that small, secrets had a way of coming out. Yet, having Katie around seemed to completely rejuvenate Stephen. He started changing his style, wearing tighter shirts, form-fitting jeans, and he trimmed his salt and pepper beard down to a trendy stubble. He even grew his hair out and started smiling a lot more, although his smiles didn't always seem genuine. Alyssa kept a close eye on him, picking up on how his focus had shifted, the way his gaze would linger just a little too long whenever Katie was talking, and how his whole demeanor soured the moment she left the room. Then came the night that shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy. Stephen decided he was going to sleep on the floor in Katie's bedroom. When Alyssa walked in and saw him, she was floored. She demanded to know what on earth he was doing. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "It's none of your business," he shot back. That was the moment she knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She tried to warn Katie, to make her understand the kind of man Stephen truly was. His temper, his need for control, his manipulative games. But Katie just wasn't hearing it. So, in November of 2016, Alyssa finally filed for divorce. She packed up her belongings, got her 2 younger girls, and left that house for the last time. For years, she had lived in fear of Stephen's rage, but walking away felt like the only option she had left to salvage what was left of her family. Stephen made no move to stop her. He just stood there in the doorway, watching her car drive off until it was out of sight. And a strange look crossed his face, because for Stephen, Alyssa leaving wasn't a loss, it was an opportunity. The months after Alyssa moved out only blurred the line between what was normal and what was absolutely unthinkable. Stephen and Katie were now living under the same roof, just the two of them, and with no one else around to enforce any kind of boundaries. That father-daughter relationship started to warp into something much, much darker. During weekend visits, he would tell his two younger daughters that Katie was special and that they had to treat her with respect. But when one of the girls asked what she should call her older sister, Stephen answered, without a moment's hesitation, "Call her stepmom." It wasn't just disturbing, it was a boundary that no one could ever imagine being crossed. And by May of 2017, Alyssa was about to find out just how far over that line he had gone. Alyssa discovered her 11-year-old daughter's diary lying open on her bed. Inside, scrawled in the innocent script of a child, was a sentence that sent a chill down her spine. "My dad calls her baby. His baby. My dad says she's my stepmom." There were even drawings, one of her father with horns, with the simple label, "The Devil." Alyssa's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, each one confirming the horrifying truth she had suspected but couldn't bring herself to believe. Stephen wasn't just manipulating Katie, he was in a full-blown relationship with his own daughter. And now, impossibly, she was pregnant. Alyssa's mind was reeling. She snatched her phone and immediately called him, her rage and disbelief boiling over. The second he answered, she didn't even let him get a word in. "You got her pregnant," she screamed into the phone. "I thought you knew," he replied calmly. "We're in love." It was a statement that would echo in Alyssa's mind for years to come, not just for what it meant, but for the chilling, casual way he said it. Alyssa slammed the phone down and immediately called the police. She filed a report, laying out every single detail, the diary entries, his confession over the phone, the pregnancy. Detectives launched an investigation, but because Stephen and Katie were both legal adults, and they couldn't find any immediate proof of coercion, no arrests were made. It was a baffling legal gray area that was almost impossible to wrap your head around. A biological father and his daughter. They were now openly a couple, and the legal system was paralyzed by the thorny issue of consent. So, Stephen and Katie just packed up and skipped town, leaving Virginia behind. Their new life began in Knightdale, North Carolina, where they moved into a quiet suburban house with Stephen's mother, Grace. To anyone looking in, they just seemed like an odd couple, certainly not a father and his daughter, but two people starting over. The neighbors would see them walking hand in hand, completely oblivious to the disturbing reality of their relationship. But behind closed doors, their delusion was their reality. They meticulously set up a nursery, getting ready for the baby, and told anyone who pried that they were spiritually married, even if the law hadn't caught up. The secrecy was over. In their minds, love justified everything, but they were on a collision course with the law and society's judgment. By the summer of 2017, the so-called family reunion had morphed into something deeply unsettling. He was 42 years old. She was just 20, and they weren't hiding it anymore. On July 20th, 2017, they took a quiet drive over the state line into Maryland. To get their marriage license, they just flat out lied, claiming they had no biological connection. Nobody looked twice, no questions were asked. It was just a matter of paperwork and a few signatures. Making the whole scene even more bizarre, both of their mothers were there. Grace Plattel stood next to her son, her face a mask of strained, uncomfortable silence, while Kelly and Anthony Fusco, the parents who had actually raised Katie, could only watch in a state of heartbreak and utter confusion, powerless to stop a union that defied all reason. The wedding photos tell the whole story. Stiff smiles, awkwardly placed hands, and an air of forced acceptance. It was one of those moments where everyone in the room knew something was deeply wrong, but nobody knew how to say it. Following the short ceremony, Katie posted a picture to her social media, a simple shot of her in a cream-colored dress, standing next to Stephen. Her caption read, "Nothing fancy, just love." To the average person scrolling their feed, it was just another happy wedding announcement. But for the few who knew the truth, it was a waking nightmare, masquerading as a normal life. Just 2 months later, in September of 2017, Katie delivered a baby boy they named Bennett. Stephen proudly called him their miracle. "Our second chance at a family," he boasted to a neighbor. And for a while, their little house in Knightdale, North Carolina, blended right in. From the street, everything looked perfectly calm, but on the inside, Stephen's obsession was growing. He was watching Katie's every move, controlling who she saw and where she went, blowing up her phone if she was out for too long. By January of 2018, that carefully constructed illusion of a normal family was beginning to shatter. The whispers were getting louder, and the secrets they kept locked away were starting to show up in official documents. Back in Virginia, law enforcement had quietly dusted off the old file that Alyssa Plattel had filed months before, the one detailing her concerns about her ex-husband and their daughter. Only this time, investigators had hard evidence they simply could not ignore. On a cold January morning, the charade came to an end. Both Stephen and Katie Plattel were arrested, facing a slew of charges, including incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The warrants were issued out of Henrico County, Virginia, but it was officers in Knightdale, North Carolina, who descended on that quiet suburban home to make the arrest. Neighbors would later recall seeing police cars lining their street for hours, with no idea what was going on. It wasn't until the story broke on the local news that the stomach-turning truth was revealed. The couple next door wasn't just a married couple, they were father and daughter. Both were extradited back to Virginia to be processed separately. During booking, Katie looked terrified and withdrawn, her hair pulled back and her eyes cast downward. Stephen, on the other hand, was a stone wall, expressionless, almost eerily calm, as if the weight of his actions hadn't sunk in. They both managed to post bond soon after and were released. But the judge laid down a strict order, absolutely no contact of any kind. That meant they were legally forbidden from seeing or even speaking to one another while the case moved forward. As for their infant son, Bennett, he was placed into the custody of his grandmother, Stephen's mother, Grace Plattel, who lived in Cary, North Carolina. She had spent months trying to convince herself to believe her son's story, that this was all about love, not manipulation. But even she was having a hard time reconciling the situation. Outside the courthouse, the case took another bizarre turn when Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman, addressed the press. And what he said sent shockwaves through everyone listening. "This case is about two adults who fell in love," he declared. "They never even knew each other for 18 years. The fact that they're biologically related," he continued, "never seemed to be an issue for them." His statement didn't just raise eyebrows, it ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Online forums, talk radio, and TV panels exploded in outrage. Many viewed the statement as a twisted narrative, a defense that completely ignored years of manipulation against Alyssa, who had been warning everyone that Stephen was a threat. It felt like she was being betrayed all over again. After her release, Katie fled North Carolina, returning to New York to live with her adoptive parents, Tony and Kelly Fusco. She was emotionally shattered, overwhelmed with shame, and desperately trying to piece her life back together. Her parents welcomed her home with open arms, determined to help her heal. But the emotional wounds were incredibly deep. For the first time since reconnecting with her biological father, Katie started to see the real him, not a loving parent, but a master manipulator who had built her life on a foundation of lies. Finally, with some distance, she could see the truth. But as she attempted to start over, Stephen wasn't about to let her go that easily. For him, the separation wasn't an ending. It was the start of something far more sinister. Katie started going to therapy and began reaching out to old friends. And for the first time, her perspective shifted. She wasn't his partner. She was his victim. Then, one evening in early April of 2018, She picked up the phone and made the one call Stephen had always dreaded. "I can't do this anymore," she told him. "It's over." That one phone call shattered what little stability he had left. In the days that followed, Stephen completely shut down. He stopped replying to his mother's texts, ignored his lawyer's calls, and just sat for hours alone in his darkened house in Knightdale, North Carolina. Empty bottles started piling up next to his recliner, and neighbors would later recall hardly ever seeing him leave the house. His mother, Grace, noticed the disturbing change right away. She pleaded with him, reminding him of his responsibilities and of his baby boy, Bennett, who needed his father to be stable. But Stephen's world had shrunk to a single obsession: getting his son back and somehow fixing everything he had destroyed. He was convinced that if he could just see Katie one more time, he could make her change her mind. On the evening of April 11th, Stephen showed up at his mother's house in Cary, North Carolina, and asked if he could take Bennett for the night. He told Grace he was planning to drive the baby up to New York the next morning to see Katie, claiming he wanted to make things right. Grace was hesitant, but she finally agreed. Before he left, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but a profound emptiness. She would later recount that chilling moment in a shaky statement to the police. He promised he would take the baby to Katie and then come right home, but he never did. The night passed in silence, as Grace waited for a text or a call that never arrived. She called his phone again and again, but every call went straight to voicemail. At first, she tried to convince herself everything was fine, that he'd made the long drive safely and was with Katie, maybe even working things out. But as the hours crept past midnight, her worry slowly solidified into a cold, hard dread. By dawn, she knew in her gut that something was terribly wrong. She picked up her phone to try him one last time. When he finally called back, the few words he spoke were enough to shatter her entire world. Moments after hanging up, Grace was dialing 911, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hit the numbers. "My son just called me," she managed to tell the dispatcher. "He said he ended his baby's life, and now he's on his way to New York." What she failed to mention was that legally, Stephen wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Katie, a detail she'd seemingly overlooked when he first said he was going to see her. When police arrived at Stephen's house in Nightdale, they had to force their way in. Inside, they found 7-month-old Bennett, unresponsive. The cause of death was later determined to be suffocation, but Stephen left no note, and no one could ever explain what happened in those final, tragic moments. Meanwhile, more than 500 miles away in New Milford, Connecticut, a second tragedy was already in motion. Around 8 a.m., Katie and her adoptive father, Tony Fusco, were driving along Route 55 and Route 7 on their way to visit her grandmother. It was a routine trip, a drive they made 2 times a week. They had no idea that just a few hundred yards back, Stephen was tailing them in a rented minivan. He had driven all night, fueled by a toxic mix of obsession and grief. As the light at the intersection turned red, he pulled up right next to their car and lowered his window. What happened next took only a few seconds, but it instantly ended 2 lives. Witnesses later told police they heard a rapid succession of loud bangs, followed by screams and the sound of glass shattering. Cars screeched to a halt as people scrambled for cover. The 911 caller was an off-duty New York firefighter who happened to be passing by. He initially reported that the vehicle had a South Carolina license plate, but he quickly corrected himself and confirmed it was a North Carolina plate. First responders raced to the scene, but it was already too late. Katie, at just 20 years old, and Tony, who was 56, were both pronounced dead before the ambulance even arrived. Roughly 30 minutes later, New York State Police found his van parked on a rural road in Dover, not far from where Katie had spent her childhood. Inside, they discovered Stephen had taken his own life. The man, who had once claimed to adore his daughter, had now annihilated his entire family, and with him, he buried the twisted logic he used to justify it all. In the span of a single morning, 3 generations were erased: a grandchild, a daughter, and a father. In the days that followed, 2 states were united in a single tragedy, as police from North Carolina and Connecticut held joint press conferences, piecing together the timeline and confirming that the same man had ended 3 lives within just a few hours. In her first interview after the tragedy, Alyssa Plattel spoke through tears, describing a man she once loved but had come to fear deeply. He was someone she had warned others about for years. He was dangerous. He was isolated, she explained. I lost my daughter 3 times. At birth, to him, and now, forever. Katie was laid to rest beside her adoptive father, Tony Fusco, in Dover, New York. The very town where she had once dreamed of becoming an artist, the same place she had always believed she was safe. And now, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We read every single one of them, because every perspective matters. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you for the next case.